Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Friday Ramblings. We're here to discuss some more wrestling championship history. Why? Because it's fun. And of course, more importantly, because wrestling championships are in the most memorable wrestling angles and feuds of all time. The main prize to be had and the thing that drives these men to great competition with each other. Knowing your wrestling championship history means knowing your wrestling history. And knowing your wrestling history means understanding why it is a form of entertainment that has persevered for over 100 years despite often being misunderstood and occasionally mocked by other forms of entertainment in general. Not to mention some of the news media, which is a sad thing. But this one's going to be a little short and sweet because we're dealing with a championship that did not have a very long lineage. It was only around for a handful of years. We are talking about the WWF, later WWE European Championship. And as you recall in our previous episode on the Intercontinental title, we did mention the European Championship a couple times. When it crossed paths, we will do so again here for the sake of completionist. But primarily, as I said, this will be a short and sweet, quick and easy one. Because this was a title that was created for a reason that quickly became moot, which is in the late 90s, the WWF, as it was then known, was in the process of branching out into Europe, and at that point had a lot of plans to tour Europe regularly. These plans changed as the finances of the company changed, as well as what wrestlers they had around and how well those wrestlers sold tickets in Europe, specifically the United Kingdom. Although there were tours in various other parts of Europe, including the night the first European champion was crowned. And of course, when we talk about wrestlers who are over in Europe and the United Kingdom as that center point, you have to talk about the British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith. Now, the aforementioned Bulldog was a long-standing wrestler, having started off in his native England before really making a name for himself in Canada as part of Stu Hart's Stampede Wrestling, marrying one of Stu Hart's daughters, thus making him a brother-in-law to the equally legendary Bret and Owen Hart, who will pop up again later. And eventually migrating, like Bret and Owen did on separate occasions, into the WWF, where with his partner in the original British Bulldogs tag team, the Bulldog would achieve great tag team glory before moving on to singles glory, himself winning the Intercontinental title once. All leading up to 1997, where as a guy guaranteed to sell out arenas in the United Kingdom if you promoted him, hey, here's a guy that deserved to be your champion of Europe. Thus, a tournament was held over several shows in Germany, culminating in a finals victory that aired on a live Raw. From a production standpoint, this is an infamous Raw because it was one of the first times that they had done a live Raw where they were having to run the signal all the way over from Europe, and that meant using non-standard production facilities and equipment because WWE, their stuff was in America primarily, as well as having portions of the show still taking place in the USA. Not all the talent went over. again, it was one of these like experimental shows they were doing. So there's parts of the show where like literally you can hear a distinct difference in the audio levels, just because it's like, okay, these are segments we filmed, you know, here in America with our standard equipment that we know how to optimize. Here's stuff we had to film kind of, you know, out there in Germany with equipment we're not familiar with, that we're having to rush transmit, you know, bouncing off satellites. You know, it was a thing. It was 90s television technology. So historically, it's a very interesting Raw to go back and watch. For reference, that would be the February 26th, 1997 Raw, and it was from Berlin specifically. Well, no, excuse me. The match was that particular match was pre-recorded on February 26th. It aired on the March 3rd Raw. Let me get that straight. Okay. So some of Raw was live, some was pre-taped. As I said, it was a really experimental Raw with doing an international broadcast. They'd done international pay-per-views before, but you know, pay-per-view, you have different things going on. But yes, on March 3rd, the British Bulldog was crowned the European Champion over his then tag team partner, Owen Hart. For reference, tournament went with British Bulldog defeating Mankind in the first round, Vader defeating Rocky Maivia, the man who would go on to become The Rock, aka Dwayne Johnson. Owen Hart defeated Flash Funk, and Bret Hart defeated Hunter Hearst Helmsley. In the second round, British Bulldog beat Vader. Owen Hart beat Bret Hart by countout, as opposed to every other match which had been won by pin or submission to this point. Before in the finals, the British Bulldog pinning Owen Hart to win the title. Now, here's where things get a little fun. At the time, the British Bulldog and Owen Hart were tag team partners and had for the last year plus, couple of years for Owen more so than British Bulldog, been involved in rivalries with Bret. Owen and Bret themselves had some iconic matches in the previous couple of years, including an incredible steel cage match at SummerSlam. Thus, they were not only tag team partners, but neither one of them had been on good terms with Bret Hart. A few weeks after the finals of the tournament, Owen had challenged Bret to a rematch, with Owen playing once again the role of the jealous family member, hinting that he may ruin his relationship with Davey as he had with Bret in recent previous years. However, before the match could really get going, Bret would come down, talk to both men, convince them not to fight over the European Championship, but to stay united, and in fact to reunite with him, thus creating the final and largest version of the infamous Hart Foundation group. Of course, they would later be joined by Brian Pillman, a non-relative who had trained under the Hart family and thus was a honorary Hart, as well as Bret and Owen's other brother-in-law, Jim the Anvil Neidhart, father of current WWE women's wrestler Natalya. It's all in the family, folks. But the key to all this is that the British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith would hold the European Championship for 206 days. Leading up to September 20th, 1997, the one-night-only pay-per-view in Birmingham, England, where British Bulldog defended his European Championship against Shawn Michaels. This is one of the most infamous matches in WWE history when you know the backstage politics of what's going on, as well as look at what had been done in the local media leading up to the match. Throughout 1997, Shawn and Bret had been engaged in backstage political one-upsmanship, as well as a very heated real-life rivalry with each other. This would all culminate in November 97 with the famous Montreal Screwjob match. But that's another subject for another episode. The basics of this is that Shawn, who more often than not tended to win the political backstage games, not only was in a position to go up against the British Bulldog in a pay-per-view emanating from England, where Davey Boy Smith was basically a national icon, but despite the fact that Bulldog had been assured that up until like the day of the match that he was going to be winning, he had thus gone into the local media and hyped up the fact that he would proudly defend Europe and England specifically from the American snot-nosed punk Shawn Michaels, to the point of dedicating the match to Bulldog's then terminally ill sister. So you get what we got, which was a very awkward match where, as I said, basically that day of the event, after all that press had been done and Bulldog had basically done everything he could to convince people he was going to win, or he was the biggest loser in all of Europe, where, again, he was the wrestler that was selling these tickets on these European shows more than anybody else, lost the match and his European Championship to Shawn, where Shawn's buddies, Triple H and Chyna, interfered to help him win, but the Hart Foundation, who had been engaged in a rivalry with these guys, were nowhere to be seen. Thus, again, Davey looked like the biggest idiot and loser in the whole of Europe. And more importantly, the Hart Foundation looked kind of weak because even post-match, they didn't really come out and try to get revenge or heat on Shawn or anything. It was just, a flagrant example of Shawn always got his way, whether it was good for business or not. Should be noted that they didn't do a lot of pay-per-views in England after this for a while. I think they did some after Shawn's hiatus in spring of '98 when he dropped the world title to Austin. But it was a really awkward situation. Still, 92 days later, Shawn Michaels dropped the belt to Triple H in a match after he had already won the World Championship, due to the then WWF Commissioner Sergeant Slaughter demanding the two compete, and that Shawn specifically defend the European Championship he had been basically carrying around as a, vanity plate that, heck, after winning the belt a couple weeks earlier at Survivor Series, he'd forgotten the European Championship. Triple H won the title by Shawn Michaels laying down in the middle of the ring, thus he won it in a non-fight. 40 days later, Triple H would lose the belt to Owen Hart on Raw when Triple H, not wanting to wrestle Owen, let alone for the title, claimed he was injured and sent out Goldust to wrestle Owen. Owen won the match, and after that win, Slaughter came out and declared, "Hey, as commissioner, I'm declaring him an official substitute for you," which means since Owen won the match, he won the championship because he beat the man you chose to represent you as champion. Triple H would win the belt back 55 days later, going on to hold it for 4 months before losing it to D'Lo Brown, who would later lose it to X-Pac, only for D'Lo Brown to win it back 2 days later. For X-Pac to win it back 3 days later, or excuse me, 3 weeks later. And then 4 months later, finally lose it to Shane McMahon, thanks to a lot of help from Shane's buddies in the corporation. Now, it should be noted during the 2 reigns that D'Lo Brown had with the title belt, he would show his appreciation for Europe by having his hometown be a different, well-known city somewhere in Europe each week. Shane McMahon would hold the title for 43 days before retiring as champion, only for 3 months later to hand the belt over to corporation lackey Mideon, who would ask Shane if he could have the belt. This would reactivate the European Championship, where it would go on to be held once again by D'Lo Brown, Jeff Jarrett, for 1 day before forfeiting it to Mark Henry, who had helped Jeff Jarrett win the belt off D'Lo Brown, who lost it back to D'Lo, who lost it back to the British Bulldog, who, after the Montreal incident a couple months from winning the initial title belt, had gone to WCW with Brett, only to return to WWF when WCW didn't use him for crap for about a year, caused him to injure his back with a stupid gimmick trap door that he was not actually made aware of, so he accidentally landed on it. Well, specifically on the big hinge. It was a mess of a run. Still, this meant that about a month about 1 month and 2 years after losing it to Shawn, British Bulldog had gained the European Championship back. However, he would lose it 47 days later to Val Venus, who would lose it to Kurt Angle, who would then later lose it to Chris Jericho at WrestleMania 2000 in the previously discussed match wherein the European title and Intercontinental title were both defended in a 2 out of 3 falls match. Kurt lost both belts that he had going into the match, even though he was never pinned in either pinfall, because that's the threat of the triple threat match. You would also get Chris Jericho himself would also lose the belt 1 day later to Eddie Guerrero, who would go on to hold it for a few months before losing it to his buddy Perry Saturn, who would in turn lose it to Al Snow, who, like D'Lo Brown, would declare himself as originating from various cities in Europe. Al Snow even going so far as to humorously cosplay as a citizen of the country he was from, playing up on various mass media stereotypes of the characters. For instance, when he was announced from Germany wearing lederhosen. That kind of fun. Because Al Snow's awesome and he can make anything more fun than it already is. Al would later lose it to legitimate European William Regal, who lost it to Crash Holly, regained it back 2 days later, only to lose it 50 days later to Test, who lost it to Eddie Guerrero at WrestleMania 17, who then lost it a month later to Matt Hardy, who managed to hold on to it for 125 days before losing it to longtime backstage buddy and on-air superhero the Hurricane, before Bradshaw held it for a week, eventually losing it to Christian, who lost it to Diamond Dallas Page, who is the oldest European champion on record. It is at this point that the brand split came into effect and the title became exclusive to Raw. Also brings us all the way up to 2002, the last year of the title's existence. Diamond Dallas Page will lose it to William Regal, which gives him, yet another reign, actually winning it on my birthday of March 19th on an episode of Raw, of SmackDown. Only holding it for 20 days before losing it to Spike Dudley, who held it for a month before losing it back to William Regal, who in turn lost it 2 months later to Jeff Hardy, who would only hold it for 2 weeks before the title unification match with the Intercontinental title that Intercontinental Champion Rob Van Dam would win. Thus, Rob Van Dam was the final champion, having held the belt for 1 day. So, let's get into our hard numbers. The most number of combined days is the British Bulldog with 253 days. The most number of reigns is a tie between William Regal and D'Lo Brown at 4, although William Regal had the most number of days in those 4 reigns at 179 to D'Lo Brown's 140. Good times. Chris Jericho, Jeff Jarrett, and Rob Van Dam all held the belt for a single day, making them the shortest reigning champions, which is a thing. And of course, William Regal and the British Bulldog are the only actual Europeans to hold the European Championship. So, where does that leave us with the European title? Well, very simple. For the late 90s, early O's, the European Championship was more often than not a title held by guys who were right around the middle of the card. Often people that entertained the fans well enough and were pretty solid in-ring competitors, but we're never going to be world champions. In fact, the only person who has held the world champions, or the only people that have held the world championship on this list, have been Bradshaw, who won it many years later, or several years later as JBL after completely reinventing himself, and, Jeff Hardy, who, none of his world title reigns were very long and memorable. They were basically there because he sold a lot of t-shirts when he was sober. And Chris Jericho. Honorary mention to Shawn Michaels because he had already been a world champion once before winning the European Championship, and again, he was only the second champion at a point when the European title was still defining itself and finding its place in the WWE hierarchy. So, that's out of, 27 champions. One on a technicality with Shawn, and 3 others would go on to be world champions. Although again, as should often be noted, just because you've never held a world championship does not mean you are a bad wrestler. it is, as I said, the place of the European Championship. It was for guys that were solid performers, but were never, or most likely never, going to be the top of the mountain. Still, if you are watching pay-per-views from that 97-2002 era, or even random Raws and SmackDowns, and you see a European Championship match, by all means, watch it. Because 9 out of 10 times, you're going to be assured of a pretty good match. It was a title that was always, a nice breath of fresh air in between hardcore matches or long-winded but incredibly funny Rock promos. You had the European Champion come out. Have a good time. Maybe hail themselves from Europe just for the fun of it. Maybe not. Still, as I said, if you stumble across some European Championship matches, give them a view. You should enjoy them. Oh, wait, no, excuse me. I'm going to amend back what I said. So we got to give one more honorary mention to Diamond Dallas Page. He had previously been a WCW champion before coming to WWE. So I was right in my initial assessment. He never became a WWE champion after winning the European Championship. So in his case, it was not seen as a stepping stone title like it was for guys like Chris Jericho and Jeff Hardy, who held the championship on their way up the ladder. So just want to throw that in for some of you folks that I know we're going to sit there and go, hey, Diamond Dallas Page was world champion. Yes, but not in WWE. And previous to winning the European Championship, which, like I said, with Shawn, only gets you an honorary mention because it kind of defeats the purpose of the title being a sign you're on your way up. They had already been up. Still, we're going to be back next week with some non-wrestling talk, but it's still going to be entertaining talk. So join us for another rambling. And remember, you can be critical if you're constructive, because we at Roulette Productions do not believe in hating just for the sake of hating. I love all my viewers. I hope you come back and join me in 7. We will ramble every Friday. Bye-bye.